In part 1 of my shipping container video, we left off with me having leveled the container with blocks. I would go on to build a deck in front of the container, hanging 4 vertical supports that I could use to build a deck up on top of the container as well. That's all the background we need to get up to the second story cabin, and so let's dive right in. I want to be respectful of your time, so the sections of this video will be timestamped below. To build on top of a shipping container, it seems to me the most logical thing to do is to weld something that you can build to. I took some robust angle steel, 4" by 4", 3/8 inches thick, and welded it around the perimeter of the container. That allowed me to build a 2x6 frame up on top of the container and on those vertical supports on the deck. I used the drill press to drill holes in the angle steel, and it was so stinking hot and bright and crazy up there that I could not even think, and welded 2 of these things upside down so that the holes I needed were actually just welded to the container. That's what we call a Coyote Lab BHM. I mentioned spacing the angles around the perimeter of the container, but I also put a setback on them. Notice that they're not sitting flush with the edge. I wanted the building to sit flush with the edges of the container, and so I set these back to account for that. The footprint of this building is 1/2 of the container. This container is 20 feet by 8, so the building is 10 feet by 8. Now, to have the upper cabin sit flush with the container, I need to space it back 1.5 inches for the 2x6, 1/2 inch for the sheathing, and another 1.5 inches for the siding. So I had to set those angles back 3.5 inches. Since I started working on this container, its corrugations have caused me problems in a lot of ways that I haven't predicted. On the end of the roof of the container, there's a 6.5 inch lip. That pencil line is my 3.5 inch line where I would otherwise want my angle bracket. But that lip causes me a problem, so I had to back the angle way up and weld it to a flat part of the container. I had to take 2 additional 2x6s and wedge them in there so that the exterior frame had some support up to the angle. I then put 2 1/2 inch carriage bolts through each one of these brackets. I ended up replacing these with galvanized bolts and getting them all facing the right way. I didn't want this frame sitting directly on the roof, and so there's a little bit of spacing between the actual roof and the frame all the way around. One other note, welding on the roof of a built shipping container is a terrible idea. The weld heats the inside, and the inside, when hot, will catch the insulation or siding or whatever on fire. So that's great. You can see I'm welding, I'm running inside to check, smoke's billowing out the door. That's all absolutely wonderful. Because I had logistical issues at the original building site, I could not weld these brackets then. So I kept a hose at the ready, ran in, checked, and everything turned out fine. Lastly, you cannot have bare steel up here, either on the roof or on the angles themselves. And so recoating this with some elastomeric. From there, I went ahead and built this deck. That'll be a separate video, but I needed to build most of the deck to have a surface to work from in which I could build this cabin. I bought the best subfloor that I could find, which is 1 1/8 inch thick Advanatech flooring. This stuff can be exposed to the elements for some time, which was key because I knew it would take me some time to complete this project. And it's guaranteed to be squeak free. The difficulty is each sheet weighs about 125 pounds, so it was a real chore getting these where they needed to be. The subfloor specs tell you what kind of glue and what kind of nails to use, and so that's pretty straightforward. This is tongue and groove flooring, no banging on the tongue or the groove. Use a little block to slide the sheets together. Since the cabin's only 8 by 10, I only needed 2 full sheets and 1 half sheet of the flooring to finish the job. I then finished the deck all the way up to the subfloor except for 1 board, leaving that space to hang the sheathing and the siding. I'll move through the wall framing fairly quickly, noting that I referred largely to the complete book of framing. YouTube's great, but a reference manual can be really helpful on something like this. I really wore this book out, and the Dallas Public Library was incredibly pleased when I brought the book back in 47 pieces. And I used screws rather than nails for the most part, knowing that I would make some mistakes around the doors and windows that needed to be corrected. I certainly made those mistakes and was glad that I used those screws. I also wasn't quite sure how much slope I wanted on the roof. My first draft only had about ½ an inch of drop for every foot of sidewall, which I didn't think was enough. So I shortened that sidewall a little bit and took it down to about a full inch of drop for every foot of sidewall. Once I was happy with the walls, I went ahead and hung the top plates. I built this little cabin to have a low-pitched shed roof. I wanted a flat style roof to match the shipping container below it, which of course has a flat roof, but I didn't want to actually build a flat roof since those tend to have water drainage issues. I also wanted a low pitch because the winds out here are nasty, and a high-pitched roof tends to be more susceptible to high wind. The key with the shed roof is to find a joist that works and then just copy it for all the other joists. For this type of roof, you cut a bird's mouth using a speed square. If you're like me, it takes you a minute to remember or figure out how this works, and so you've got your correct and your wrong side of the boards from things you tried that didn't work. And this roof has a tiny little bird's mouth because it has a low pitch. Some might call it a chickadee's mouth. I'll show myself out. Because the roof has a pitch, the joists need to be plumbed, and so I check and confirm the angle with a level, and then make the cuts on the miter saw. I try to use salvage material where I can, and we'll see more of that in part 2 of this video. For the interior joists, I was able to use some reclaimed barn joist that I got from a property that I recently sold. I was able to tear down the barn just before selling it. Our judges gave this limp barn teardown a 12. That's out of 100. Cut my plumb angles on this 4x6 salvage wood. And then I can cut my little bird's mouth using the same guide. And get these hung up. The building is framed at every 16 inches on center, but these joists are set at every 24 inches. Then hurricane ties, just to keep everything strong. Here's the subfascia on the door side. I've got about a 12-inch overhang on all sides of this cabin. I really didn't want to have the overhang, again trying to sort of match the look of the container below, but I like the idea of it for some water protection. And then a deli slice for some more support. and some 2x6s in between the joists. About this time, I started having some mild nightmares about falling off of this structure. I'm pretty sure I can parkour roll out of an 8-foot fall off a container, but probably not a fall this high. And I found a video that shows you how to make a rope harness, which I would throw on and then tie off once I went up there. And that gave me a bit more peace of mind. The sheathing I decided to use is 7/16 inch OSB made by Weyerhaeuser. I made that after reading a lot of internet stuff with people yelling at each other about what's better as between house wrap and zip system. 2 reasons I didn't use the zip system. One is I just couldn't find it very easily around town. And the second is I'm going to use a cedar siding, which evidently does not do that well with keeping water out. And I had read that the house wrap that I'll end up using is very good at water protection, so I decided to give it a whirl. Because the cabin sits flush with the side and the back of the container, I had to build 2 makeshift scaffolding setups so that I could sheathe the outside of the frame. Here they are, but here I'm actually standing on the roof of an outhouse. I like to do a thought experiment sometimes where I go back to myself at 20 and say, hey man, in 20 years, you're gonna be doing X, Y, or Z. In this case, running a substantial risk of falling through the roof of a hastily built outhouse. What do you think about that? I would love to know. OSB is smooth on one side and rough on the other and has these grid lines that you can see here. And I actually wasn't sure about which side faces out. The internet seems to just argue with itself over which one's correct, and so I did the smart thing. I put some way and the other way. That way I could not be wrong. I would later text my old man and say, what do you think? His reply there at the bottom, I don't know. There should be a spec sheet. Can you find it? I had read the spec sheet, but I didn't see anything. So I went back to it and I found it. Prepare yourself for the release of tension in this dumb story. The spec sheet says it doesn't matter. Another robust internet argument involves what tool to use to cut out the sheathing around the doors and windows. My philosophy is use what you got and what you're comfortable with. And so not the finest work, but a chainsaw gets the job done. Here's some B-roll of a deer looking for a small UFO in a tree as we head into the last portion of the video. I wanted to expose my salvage roof joists, so I took some tongue and groove cedar and laid that down on top of the joists. I did that by cutting the tongue off the first cedar board and hanging it flush with the front of the building. I'll come back and deal with that overhang later. This tongue and groove wanted to fight me a little bit, and so maybe I should have cut the groove off rather than the tongue. When you install tongue and groove on a wall, you're putting the groove onto the tongue, not the tongue into the groove. So maybe I should have tried that. However, once I got about 6 or 7 of these boards down, it started to go a little bit easier. I developed a technique using this block. Bring about a dozen of those blocks. That way when you kick them off the roof, you'll have another one. The technique sort of just involved working up and down the boards, finding places where the tongue would go in the groove cleanly, not pop back out, and then leaving everything kind of loose and going back later and getting it hammered in. In part 2, I'll put the insulation on top of this roof and then add the metal roofing. Here's how this building works. From the front of the container, it's up the staircase, and that takes you to the door. And on the inside, we've got our 8 by 10 foot spare bedroom. Those are the joists. That's what the ceiling will look like. The window on the right will be used for an air conditioning unit. I'll pick up with the house wrap and finish this build in part 2. See y'all then.